The history books gave you a hero, a tin star on his chest, a six-shooter on his hip, and a moral code that never wavered. Every single part of that is a lie. The real Wild West sheriff was a killer, a thief, and sometimes the most dangerous outlaw in the entire territory. The badge was not a symbol of justice. It was a license to steal, murder, and run criminal empires with complete impunity. These are 20 dark secrets about Wild West sheriffs that will make you realize the outlaws were not the real problem. The men hunting them were far, far worse. Subscribe to our channel and give our videos some hype to help us out. On number 20, the most famous sheriff in Montana was running an outlaw gang. Henry Plummer was elected sheriff of Bannock, Montana in May 1863. The townspeople loved him. He was described as intelligent, well-spoken, and charming. What they did not know was that Plummer was simultaneously running a gang of road agents called the Innocents. The gang used secret handshakes and code words to identify each other. They robbed gold shipments, attacked stagecoaches, and murdered travelers on the roads between mining camps. Plummer knew the exact timing of every gold shipment because citizens reported them directly to their trusted sheriff. When suspicion finally fell on Plummer, vigilantes dragged him from his home on January 10, 1864. His last words were reportedly a request for a quick death. The vigilantes hanged him on the same gallows he had built for executing criminals. The large-scale gold robberies stopped almost immediately after his death. But here is the strangest part. In 1993, Montana held a posthumous trial for Plummer. The jury deadlocked 6-6. To this day, some historians believe Plummer was innocent, and the vigilantes simply wanted him dead for political reasons. The truth died with him on that cold January night. On number 19, sheriffs were paid so poorly that crime was almost inevitable. Here is what nobody talks about. Many Wild West sheriffs received no salary at all. Their entire income came from collecting bounties on wanted men and taking a percentage of fines from people they arrested. Think about that for a second. A federal marshal in the 19th century received a base annual salary of $200. That is roughly $6,000 in today's money. To survive, marshals had to earn fees by serving warrants, making arrests, and collecting on bounties. The more people they arrested, the more money they made. This created an obvious problem. Lawmen had a financial incentive to arrest as many people as possible, whether or not they were actually guilty. Many sheriffs supplemented their income by running protection rackets, collecting bribes, or simply taking second jobs in saloons and brothels. The badge was supposed to represent law and order. In reality, it often represented poverty and desperation. On number 18, Wyatt Earp had a criminal record before he ever wore a badge. Everyone knows Wyatt Earp as the legendary lawman who cleaned up Tombstone. What they do not know is that Earp was accused of horse theft in 1871, escaped from jail, and fled to Illinois as a fugitive. In 1870, he faced serious accusations of embezzling funds while serving as a lawman in Missouri. Before becoming the heroic figure of Hollywood films, Earp ran saloons and was connected to brothels in multiple frontier towns. He was described by one historian as a pimp, a cheat, a claim jumper, and a cold-blooded murderer. He was also accused of selling painted rocks to prospectors, claiming they were gold nuggets. After the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, Earp was charged with murder. He left Arizona under a cloud of suspicion, with warrants for his arrest. He was arrested twice in Nome, Alaska, for being drunk and disorderly. The legendary biography that created his heroic reputation was written 2 years after his death, and historians now consider it significantly fictitious. The real Wyatt Earp was no angel. The truth simply got buried under decades of Hollywood mythology. On number 17, the sheriff of Tombstone was allied with the Outlaws. Johnny Behan became the first sheriff of Cochise County, Arizona, in February 1881. Almost immediately, he aligned himself with a gang of cattle rustlers and criminals known as the Cowboys. Behan worked at the Grand Hotel Saloon, a known hangout for outlaws, and used his political connections to protect them from prosecution. When Wyatt Earp tried to arrest members of the Cowboys, Behan interfered. When the Earps killed 3 outlaws at the OK Corral, Behan testified against them, claiming the outlaws had surrendered peacefully. His testimony was contradicted by a forensic doctor, and the Earps were exonerated. After the gunfight, when Virgil Earp was ambushed and permanently maimed, and Morgan Earp was assassinated, Behan formed a posse to hunt down Wyatt Earp. That posse was composed almost entirely of cowboys, the same outlaws suspected of the attacks. In January 1882, Behan was arrested for collecting tax bills twice, essentially stealing from citizens. An investigation found he had secretly set aside $5,000 in funds from unknown sources during his time as sheriff. He lost re-election and died in 1912, with syphilis listed as a contributing cause on his death certificate. He had contracted it 30 years earlier, in 1882, while sheriff of Tombstone. On number 16, many sheriffs openly ran brothels and gambling operations. This was not a hidden scandal. It was standard practice. During his time as deputy sheriff of Dodge City, Kansas, Bill Tillman was accused of corruption, selling whiskey to Native Americans, running a brothel, and facilitating illegal gambling. He was arrested several times for these offenses. None of it stopped him from continuing to serve as a lawman for decades. Sheriffs in frontier towns understood the economy. The saloons, gambling halls, and brothels were where the money flowed. Many lawmen simply inserted themselves into those businesses rather than trying to shut them down. They collected protection money, took ownership stakes, and used their badges to eliminate any competition. The law was not applied equally in the Wild West. It was applied selectively based on who was paying whom. On number 15, the badge was often a license to kill without consequence. In the summer of 1869, James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, was elected sheriff of Ellis County, Kansas. The townspeople wanted someone tough enough to bring the crime rate under control. Hickok delivered. He killed at least 2 people in shootouts during his brief tenure. The problem was that Wild Bill's approach was considered too aggressive, even by Wild West standards. His reputation became, as one contemporary described it, more feared than loved. He was voted out of office after only a few months. replaced by his own deputy, Peter Lanahan, who was nicknamed Rattlesnake Pete. When sheriffs killed, there were rarely consequences. Inquests were brief, juries were sympathetic to lawmen, and the legal system had no real mechanism for holding sheriffs accountable. A sheriff could claim self-defense, justified force, or resisting arrest, and the matter would be closed. The badge provided immunity that outlaws could only dream about. On number 14, law enforcement was politically motivated and arbitrary. According to historian Stuart Traub, who studied Wild West law enforcement extensively, the system was disorganized, erratic, contradictory, and in many instances politically motivated and arbitrary. Sheriffs clashed with town marshals. Marshals clashed with federal officials. Jurisdictions overlapped in ways nobody could clearly define. It was not uncommon for a federal marshal to arrest a county sheriff on trumped-up charges simply because they belonged to different political factions. The law was a weapon, and sheriffs wielded it against their enemies just as readily as they used it against actual criminals. Peace officers used their influence to confiscate lands, settle old scores, and eliminate business competitors. The line between lawman and outlaw was not just blurry. In many cases, it did not exist at all. On number 13, sheriffs routinely stole from prisoners. When you were arrested in a Wild West jail, you were at the complete mercy of the sheriff. There was no oversight. There were no inspectors. There was no one to report abuse to. Sheriffs and their deputies regularly confiscated valuables from prisoners and simply kept them. Wealthy prisoners could buy privileges, cleaner cells, better food, even private quarters, all for the right price. Poor prisoners suffered in overcrowded, disease-ridden conditions. In some towns, the amount of money you had determined whether you rotted in a cell for months or walked free the next morning. Bribery was not corruption in the Wild West. It was how the system operated. The frontier jail was a revenue source, and sheriffs treated it accordingly. On number 12, the fee system turned tax collection into legalized theft. Sheriffs in many jurisdictions served as tax collectors for their counties. Their compensation came as a percentage of what they collected, so the more taxes they gathered, the more money they made personally. Johnny Bayon in Tombstone assessed the Southern Pacific Railroad at $8 million in 1882. The railroad appealed, and the assessment was reduced to $1 million, which cut Bayon's personal take by about $25,000. That is over $700,000 in today's money that Bayon expected to pocket from a single assessment. Some sheriffs collected the same taxes twice. Others inflated assessments on businesses and individuals who could not afford lawyers to fight back. The fee system created a direct financial incentive for sheriffs to squeeze every possible dollar from the citizens they were supposed to protect. On number 11, deputies were often worse than the sheriffs who hired them. Sheriffs were allowed to hire their own deputies without any oversight, background checks, or qualifications. Many simply hired their friends, their drinking buddies, or men who owed them favors. The result was predictable. In Fort Worth, Texas, the year-end police report from 1903 recorded the arrests of 4 sheriff's deputies on various criminal offenses. None of the cases made it into the newspaper. The same patterns repeated across the frontier. Deputies robbed travelers, assaulted prisoners, and used their limited authority to run petty criminal operations. John Henry Selman served as a deputy under a crooked sheriff named John Larn in Shackelford County, Texas. Together, they terrorized citizens and rustled cattle. Selman later became a constable in El Paso, where he shot the notorious outlaw John Wesley Hardin in the back. Karma eventually caught up with Selman when he was killed in a drunken quarrel in 1896. His headstone simply reads, El Paso Constable, with no mention of his criminal history. On number 10, sheriffs collected bounties by splitting rewards with outlaws. Here is a detail that sounds like fiction, but was documented practice. Some sheriffs worked directly with outlaws to collect bounty money. The arrangement was simple. The outlaw would turn himself in. The sheriff would collect the reward, and they would split the money. The outlaw would then escape from custody and repeat the process in another jurisdiction. Bounty hunting was one of the most lucrative aspects of frontier law enforcement. Rewards could reach thousands of dollars for notorious criminals. That created an incentive for sheriffs to prioritize capturing outlaws who had high bounties rather than pursuing criminals who had harmed local citizens but were not worth any money. The system did not reward justice. It rewarded financial calculation. On number 9, vigilante committees executed sheriffs, sometimes wrongly. The case of Henry Plummer in Montana is the most famous example, but it was far from unique. When citizens lost faith in their elected sheriffs, they formed vigilante committees and dispensed their own justice. The Montana vigilantes hanged approximately 24 men in their campaign to clean up the territory. The problem is that vigilantes operated without trials, without evidence standards, and without any accountability. Men were hanged based on accusations from other accused criminals who were trying to save their own lives. The testimony of one man facing the noose pointed the finger at Plummer as the gang leader, and that was considered sufficient evidence. 3 years after Plummer was killed, the vigilantes essentially ruled the Montana mining districts. Finally, leading citizens, including the territorial governor, began to speak out against the ruthless group. Some historians now argue the vigilantes were the real criminals, and men like Plummer were innocent victims of a power grab dressed up as frontier justice. On number 8, many sheriffs had active warrants in other territories. The frontier offered something invaluable to men with criminal pasts: a fresh start. When you moved west, your history stayed behind. There were no background checks, no databases, no way for a new town to know that their freshly elected sheriff was wanted for murder 3 states away. Henry Newton Brown is the perfect example. He once rode with Billy the Kid and participated in the ambush and murder of a New Mexico sheriff in 1878. After that, he disappeared for a while before reappearing in Texas, where he worked as a deputy sheriff. He then became a ranch hand and eventually took up law enforcement again in Kansas. In April 1884, Brown and 3 accomplices robbed a bank in Medicine Lodge, Kansas, shooting several employees in the process. The locals were shocked when they discovered their lawman was the thief. Brown was due to hang in the morning, but the mob could not wait. They broke into the jail and killed him that night. On number 7, Wild West jails were torture chambers designed for profit. The Yuma Territorial Prison was infamous for its brutal conditions. Inmates endured relentless desert heat, cramped cells, and meager rations. Guards and officials accepted bribes and administered extra punishments for personal grudges. The prison was designed to terrify criminals across the entire frontier. In Bisbee, Arizona, the local jail was notorious for cramped quarters and rampant disease. Prisoners were packed far beyond capacity. Local officials exploited the misery, extracting fines and showing favoritism to anyone with money or political connections. Jails were not correctional facilities. They were profit centers. Sheriffs charged for food, for blankets, for basic human necessities. Prisoners who could not pay suffered accordingly. The justice system was pay to play, and those without funds paid with their health and their lives. On number 6, election fraud was standard practice. When Johnny Behan ran for sheriff of Cochise County, the election was tainted by what historians now recognize as obvious fraud. In one precinct, estimated to contain only 15 eligible voters, the vote came back 103-1 in favor of the Democratic candidate that Behan supported. This was not an isolated incident. The 1880 elections in Tombstone were described as rife with corruption, particularly in races involving law enforcement positions. Fraudulent ballots were allegedly supplied by outlaw gangs who had financial interests in seeing their preferred candidates win. Sheriffs who won through fraud owed debts to the criminals who helped them get elected. Those debts were paid in protection, in looking the other way, and in sharing the spoils of whatever schemes came along. The badge was not earned, it was purchased. On number 5, sheriffs were personally responsible for executions. This is a detail most people never consider. In many jurisdictions, the sheriff was required to personally carry out sentences of death. That meant the same man who arrested you, testified against you, and possibly framed you would also be the one who placed the noose around your neck. Rustic executions in the Wild West were performed primarily by hanging. The sheriff administered corporal punishment as directed by the courts. He watched over prisoners in the town jail. He collected taxes. He shoveled horse manure out of the streets. And when the time came, he killed people under the color of law. Think about the psychology of that role. The same person held the power of arrest, imprisonment, and execution. There were almost no checks on that authority. A corrupt sheriff could eliminate enemies, silence witnesses, and remove obstacles, all while claiming to serve justice. On number 4, the distinction between lawman and outlaw was essentially meaningless. In the days of the frontiersmen, people switched sides so frequently that it became impossible to tell who was the lawman and who was the criminal. Outlaws became bounty hunters to earn extra money. Wanted men in one territory were appointed as sheriffs in others. Bill Tillman, one of the legendary 3 guardsmen who cleaned up Oklahoma, was accused of corruption and criminal activity throughout his career as a lawman. He was eventually shot and killed in 1924 while trying to arrest a corrupt prohibition officer. That is either karma or tragedy, depending on how you view his own record. The popular image of the helpless citizen protected by the noble sheriff is almost exactly backward. Citizens often had to protect themselves from their sheriffs, who used badges as shields for their own criminal enterprises. On number 3, wealthy individuals privatized law enforcement for their own benefit. Unable to rely on corrupt or ineffective local sheriffs, railroad companies, banks, and corporate ranchers began hiring private security forces. The Pinkerton Detective Agency became famous for hunting outlaws, but they answered to their wealthy clients, not to the public. This privatization created even more opportunities for corruption and extortion. Private lawmen prioritized recovering stolen property over apprehending criminals, because property recovery earned rewards while capturing broke outlaws paid nothing. Corporate interests shaped law enforcement priorities in ways that had nothing to do with justice. The sheriffs who were supposed to protect ordinary citizens often worked for the same wealthy interests, creating an interlocking system where the law served money, not people. On number 2, the system was designed to fail ordinary people. Stuart Traub summarized it perfectly in his research on frontier justice. Police officers devoted much of their time and energy to those illegal activities that would earn for them the greatest monetary rewards. The system was not corrupt in spite of its design. It was corrupt because of its design. Sheriffs were underpaid, unsupervised, and given enormous power with no accountability. Of course, they became criminals. The incentives pointed directly toward corruption, and only the most principled men could resist. Those principled men usually did not last long in office. The Wild West was not tamed by heroic lawmen. It was gradually integrated into a larger, more organized system of government that replaced local sheriffs with bureaucratic police departments. The romance of the frontier sheriff disappeared along with the frontier itself. On number 1, the lawmen never actually changed. They just got better marketing. Here is the detail that really matters. When the Wild West ended and the 20th century began, nobody reformed the fundamental problems with law enforcement. They simply rebranded. The sheriffs who ran protection rackets became political bosses who collected campaign contributions. The lawmen who partnered with outlaws became officials who looked the other way for the right price. The badge that served as a license to kill became a shield against accountability. The mechanisms of corruption that thrived on the frontier are still operating today, just with better public relations. The same dynamics that allowed Henry Plummer to run an outlaw gang while wearing a badge still exist in police departments, sheriff's offices, and federal agencies across the country. The Wild West did not end. It put on a suit and moved to the capital. The frontier sheriff was a mirror, reflecting what happens when power meets poverty, when authority lacks oversight, and when the law becomes a business rather than a principle. Every uncomfortable truth in this list, the theft, the murder, the corruption, those were not quirks of a lawless era. They were the raw, unfiltered version of patterns that persist to this day. If any of these facts hit differently than you expected, drop it in the comments. I want to know which ones stopped you cold. Like this video if you think more people need to hear the real story. Subscribe because we are just getting started. And next time, we are going into the real story of frontier justice. What actually happened when someone finally tried to hold these sheriffs accountable, and why it was sometimes worse than having no law at all. Stay with us.